Before there was the man the world feared, there was a boy no one wanted. The story of Saddam Hussein does not begin with palaces, armies, or power. It begins with silence, the kind of silence that comes from absence from a home without warmth and a childhood shaped more by pain than by love. Saddam Hussein was born on the 28th of April 1937 in a small dusty village called Al-Auja near Tikrit, Iraq. His father disappeared before his birth. Some said he died of cancer. Others claimed he simply vanished. Whatever the truth, he was gone. His mother, Subha Tolfa, was left alone, pregnant, heartbroken, and already mourning another son who had died before Saddam's birth. Grief consumed her. She was so lost in despair that she tried to end her life before Saddam was even born. When she survived, she tried to give her unborn child away. This was the world Saddam entered, not with celebration but with rejection. For the first few years, Saddam lived with relatives far from his mother. He grew up without the soft hands of affection or the words of comfort every child deserves. He had no father to protect him, no mother to nurture him. Only distance, coldness, and confusion. In those early years, the seeds of loneliness were planted seeds that would later grow into something dark and unshakable. When his mother eventually remarried, young Saddam returned to her side. But his new stepfather, Hassan al-Ibrahim, was a violent, poor, and bitter man. The house became a battlefield. Saddam was beaten regularly and learned early that kindness was weakness. The boy who once feared pain began to imitate it. He studied power in the only form he saw, through fists, threats, and silence. He struggled in school, unable to read or write properly, until around the age of 10. But what he lacked in books, he made up for in burning willpower. Beneath the bruises, anger began to ferment. He dreamed not of escape, but of dominance, of a day when no one could hurt him again. That fire, once lit, would never go out. At age 10, Saddam left his abusive home and went to live with his uncle Khairallah Tulfa in Baghdad. His uncle was a former army officer and a passionate nationalist who hated Western influence and believed in Arab unity through strength and force. To a broken boy, this uncle was more than family. He was a savior and a teacher. Under his roof, Saddam found something that felt like purpose. Khairallah filled the boy's mind with books and stories of power, glory, and revenge. He spoke of betrayal by foreign powers, of the greatness Arabs once had, and of the need for strong men to restore it. Saddam listened, absorbed, and began to build an identity around those ideas. Education for Saddam was not just about reading or writing. It became about survival, mental survival. He learned that knowledge could be weaponized, that information could be used to control others. By his teenage years, Saddam was no longer just a frightened boy. He was calculating, observant, and deeply ambitious. His classmates feared him. Some said he carried a knife to school. He enjoyed that fear. For the first time in his life, being feared felt safer than being ignored. In the Baghdad of the 1950s, change was in the air. The monarchy that ruled Iraq was growing unpopular, seen as a puppet of the West. Among the young and angry, the Ba'ath Party, a movement that preached Arab unity, socialism, and revolution, was gaining power. Saddam was drawn to it like a moth to fire. Here was a cause that gave meaning to his rage, a mission that matched his desire for respect and control. He joined, and with that choice, his path toward power began. Looking back, it's easy to paint Saddam as a monster. But in these early years, we see something more tragic. A child shaped by fear, molded by rejection, and taught that survival required domination. When love is absent, power becomes the substitute. When safety is denied, control becomes an addiction. Saddam's life became proof that unhealed wounds can turn into weapons. He carried that wound quietly, covering it with the mask of strength. He learned to hide emotion, to speak less, to trust no one. Every blow from his stepfather, every insult from poverty became fuel for the man he was becoming. The man who would one day rule Iraq, not with compassion but with iron. The boy from Al-Auja was preparing to rise, and though the world did not yet know his name, history was already taking notes. By the time Saddam reached his 20s, the transformation was almost complete. The poor, unwanted boy had turned into a man who believed that fear was the only way to command loyalty. He had been hurt, humiliated, and underestimated, and he would make sure no one ever did that to him again. In his mind, weakness was death, and for the rest of his life he would do anything to avoid it. The broken beginning had forged something unbreakable, or so he thought. What started as a story of survival was slowly turning into a story of domination, and soon the world would meet not the boy who was hurt, but the man who decided to hurt others first. When Saddam Hussein arrived in Baghdad as a young man, he was not just chasing opportunity, he was chasing transformation. The city in the 1950 seconds was alive with tension, filled with whispers of revolution, and haunted by the ghosts of colonial control. Iraq had a king, but many saw him as a puppet of the British. In that atmosphere of resentment and rebellion, Saddam found a cause that matched his burning ambition: the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'athists believed in Arab unity, socialism, and strength through force. To them, weakness was a disease, and compromise was betrayal. For Saddam, this ideology was oxygen. It gave his inner rage a direction. It told him that his anger was not madness, it was patriotism, that he was not just a poor boy from a dusty village, he was a warrior for Arab destiny. Inside the Ba'ath Party, Saddam began as a minor operative, but his intensity was magnetic. He rarely spoke in meetings, preferring to observe, listen, and remember. He noticed who had power, who hesitated, and who was afraid. Even then, he understood something most politicians never do: real power does not come from speeches, it comes from silence, timing, and control of information. By his early 20s, Saddam was already trusted with dangerous tasks. The party was planning to overthrow Iraq's leader, General Abdul Karim Qasim, who had come to power after removing the monarchy. To the Ba'athists, Qasim was a traitor, a man who flirted with communists and ignored Arab unity. The solution, they decided, was assassination. Saddam volunteered immediately. He was 22 years old. The plan was simple in theory, suicidal in practice. Qasim's motorcade would pass through a narrow street in Baghdad. Saddam and 6 others would wait in hiding, armed with rifles and pistols. When the car appeared, they would unleash a storm of bullets. The day came. The car arrived. Shots exploded into the air. For a moment, Baghdad itself seemed to hold its breath. But Qasim did not die. He was wounded, his driver was killed, and Saddam himself was hit in the leg. The mission had failed. The men scattered. The city filled with soldiers hunting the attackers. Within hours, Saddam Hussein's face was plastered on most wanted posters across the capital. He fled on foot, bleeding and limping, hiding in barns and small villages, moving only at night. With the help of Ba'athist networks, he escaped to Syria and then Egypt, where the government supported Arab nationalists. In Cairo, he lived under a false name, studied law at the university, and learned something new: how to wait. Those years in exile shaped him even more than his violent youth. Saddam watched politicians, read newspapers obsessively, and practiced the art of patience. He learned that revolutions do not just need guns, they need strategy, timing, and the manipulation of fear. He understood that people do not follow the smartest leader. They follow the one who looks unbreakable. And from then on, he made sure he looked exactly that. In 1963, the Ba'ath Party finally succeeded in taking control of Iraq through a military coup. Saddam returned home full of hope, believing his time had come. But the new government was chaotic, torn by internal conflict. Within 9 months, it collapsed and the Ba'athists were removed from power. For many, it was the end. For Saddam, it was just another beginning. He stayed underground, working quietly to rebuild the party from the inside. He married his cousin Sajida and started a family. But even as a husband and father, his mind was always on politics. He began to understand how real authority works, not through elections or speeches, but through networks of loyalty, information, and fear. He learned to think like a chess player several moves ahead. In 1964, Saddam was arrested by the Iraqi police. For 2 years, he sat in prison, but he did not break. He wrote, planned, and organized from behind bars. Prison for most is a cage. For Saddam, it was a classroom. He studied how other leaders had risen, how they had fallen, and what mistakes to avoid. When he finally escaped in 1966 with help from Ba'athist insiders, it was not luck. It was precision. Guards were bribed, a getaway car was ready, and Saddam disappeared into the night. That escape made him a legend within the party. 2 years later, in 1968, the Ba'ath Party seized power again. But this time it was different. The operation was swift, bloodless, and tightly controlled. Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, a senior Ba'athist and distant relative of Saddam, became president. But behind him stood Saddam Hussein, the quiet, calculating man who had already begun to pull the strings. Saddam became vice president, officially the number 2 in the country. Unofficially, he was becoming the most powerful man in Iraq. He took control of the intelligence services and the secret police, expanding them into massive surveillance machines. He placed loyalists in key positions throughout the military, media, and government. Slowly, methodically, he built an empire of information. He didn't need to shout. He simply listened. And anyone who whispered against him eventually disappeared. By the early 1972, Saddam was no longer the poor village boy or the reckless young revolutionary. He was the architect of a regime. He smiled in public, shook hands with diplomats, and appeared in photographs beside President al-Bakr. But in private, he was already Iraq's shadow ruler. He eliminated rivals, quietly rewarded loyalty generously, and used both love and terror as instruments of control. He also understood that to rule Iraq, fear alone was not enough. People had to see progress, new buildings, new schools, new opportunities. So he launched massive public projects, nationalized the oil industry, and used the new wealth to modernize the country. On the surface, Iraq was rising, but underneath the system was built on fear. Each act of generosity came with invisible chains. Each promotion meant deeper loyalty. Each celebration hid quiet executions in the background. Saddam was not yet president, but he was already the heartbeat of Iraq's power, cold, steady, and unstoppable. By 1979, the stage was set. The aging President al-Bakr, now frail and tired, announced his resignation. Officially, it was for health reasons. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth: Saddam Hussein had taken everything except the title. Within 24 hours, he became the new president of Iraq. The rise was complete. But what came next would show the world the cost of that rise: the transformation of a wounded boy into a ruler of fear. On July 16, 1979, Saddam Hussein officially became the president of Iraq. But in truth, this moment was not the beginning of his rule. It was the unveiling of what had already been built in the shadows for years. The nation celebrated on the surface, banners waved, songs played, and fireworks burst into the Baghdad sky. But beneath that noise was a silence more powerful than any applause: the silence of fear. Just 2 weeks after taking power, Saddam showed the world and his own people what kind of leader he would be. He called for a massive Ba'ath Party meeting in Baghdad. Hundreds of officials gathered in an open-air hall. They were the elite men who had worked beside him, toasted him, trusted him. Saddam entered the stage calmly, wearing his usual dark suit and quiet smile. Then he began to read a list of names. He claimed there was a conspiracy against the government, that traitors were sitting among them, men who had betrayed Iraq in the revolution. One by one, he called out the names. As each name echoed through the loudspeakers, the accused men were dragged out by guards. Some cried, some fainted, some shouted their innocence. It didn't matter. Within hours, 66 top members of the Ba'ath Party were executed. The rest of the audience sat frozen, watching the stage, too afraid to breathe. That day, Saddam didn't just remove rivals. He rewrote the rules of power. He made loyalty public and fear personal. Every official, every soldier, every citizen understood one thing clearly: in Saddam's Iraq, safety existed only in silence. From that moment, he began building a system of control that touched every corner of life. He expanded the Mukhabarat, the Iraqi intelligence agency, turning it into one of the most feared organizations in the Middle East. They tapped phone calls, intercepted letters, and placed informants in schools, mosques, offices, and even homes. Neighbors watched neighbors. Children were taught to report on their parents if they heard criticism of the government. No one was beyond reach. One joke, one rumor, one careless word could end a life. People learned to smile in public, to praise the president on cue, and to never let their true thoughts slip. Every classroom had his portrait. Every newspaper printed his speeches. Every television channel replayed his image, his voice, his posture, his smile. Iraq became a nation where one man's shadow covered everything. But Saddam's genius, if it can be called, that was his ability to mix terror with progress. He understood that pure fear was unstable. So he balanced it with pride, achievement, and spectacle. He used Iraq's oil wealth to build grand projects, modern highways, hospitals, bridges, and schools. He gave free education and healthcare. He made sure the people saw him as the man who rebuilt Iraq. He even modernized agriculture and industry, winning applause from international observers. For many, ordinary Iraqis' life improved on the surface. They could work, study, and raise families so long as they never questioned the regime. And that was the deal: comfort in exchange for obedience. But behind those new hospitals and schools were torture chambers. Behind every parade was a mass grave waiting to be filled. Writers, journalists, artists, anyone who dared to speak the truth were silenced. Some were imprisoned. Some were executed. Some simply vanished. The streets were clean, but the prisons overflowed. Inside his government, Saddam trusted only those tied to him by blood or by fear. His sons Uday and Qusay were given immense power despite their recklessness. His cousins and half-brothers controlled the army, the intelligence network, and the economy. He believed that only family could be loyal. But even within his own family, paranoia ruled. Relatives could be punished, even executed, for the smallest suspicion of betrayal. In Saddam's Iraq, trust was an illusion. Publicly, he played the role of the father of the nation. He gave emotional speeches about unity and strength. He portrayed himself as both a hero and a victim, someone misunderstood by the West, surrounded by enemies and chosen by destiny to lead Iraq to greatness. The propaganda was relentless. Children in schools memorized poems praising him. Songs called him the Lion of Babylon and the leader of all Arabs. His face appeared on banknotes, postage stamps, textbooks, and even murals on street corners. For those watching from outside Iraq, it seemed like blind devotion. But inside the country, everyone knew the truth: devotion was survival. Love was performed because fear demanded it. Saddam's control was not just political, it was psychological. He turned fear into a national instinct. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted worship. He understood that the most dangerous rebellion begins in thought. So he didn't just police actions, he policed minds. The greatest achievement of his regime was not that people followed him, but that they stopped imagining a life without him. And yet behind the iron mask, Saddam remained haunted by his own demons. The boy who had once been powerless could never forget the sting of humiliation. That memory drove him to crush anyone who reminded him of weakness. He built statues of himself taller than any building, not out of vanity alone, but out of fear that invisibility, being forgotten, was worse than death. Through the 1,980 seconds, Iraq appeared stable, even strong. Foreign leaders visited, trade increased, and the country stood as a major regional power. But this stability was fragile, a mirror polished with fear and money. The cracks were already there, waiting for the right pressure to shatter it. Saddam's rule of fear was complete, but not secure. Like a man standing on a mountain of mirrors, he saw reflections of loyalty everywhere. Yet none were real. Beneath him, resentment simmered. Outside Iraq, the world watched, cautiously aware that this new strongman was both charismatic and unpredictable. And soon Saddam would make a decision that would test everything he had built. A decision born not of strategy, but of pride. A decision that would send Iraq and Saddam himself into a storm of war, ruin, and eventual collapse. The world had seen many dictators before, but few as calculated, as theatrical, and as paradoxical as Saddam Hussein. To the West, he was a monster. To his people, he was both protector and predator. To himself, he was destiny in human form. But destiny, as history often proves, does not last forever. By 1980, Saddam Hussein's control over Iraq was absolute. His portraits hung in every office, his speeches echoed on every radio, and his enemies were buried or silent. Yet even total control could not satisfy him. Power for Saddam was not about security. It was about expansion. And soon his hunger for dominance would push Iraq into two catastrophic wars that would define both his legacy and his downfall. The first began with a calculation, or rather a miscalculation. In neighboring Iran, a revolution had just overthrown the Shah and replaced him with an Islamic government led by Ayatollah Khomeini. To Saddam, this was both a threat and an opportunity. Iran was chaotic. Its army weakened, its leadership new. Saddam believed he could strike quickly, win easily, and emerge as the hero of the Arab world, the man who defended the region from Iranian extremism. So in September 1980, without warning, Iraq invaded Iran. The war began with the thunder of artillery and the roar of tanks crossing the border. Saddam promised his people a short, glorious victory. Instead, the conflict turned into one of the longest and bloodiest wars of the 20th century. For 8 years, Iraq and Iran bled each other dry. Entire cities were bombed, villages destroyed, and fields turned to graveyards. Over 1 million people, soldiers and civilians, died. Both sides used brutal tactics. Iraq deployed chemical weapons on Iranian troops and at times against its own Kurdish population. Child soldiers were sent into minefields. Hospitals overflowed. Families received no news of their loved ones, only folded flags and silence. But even as the body count rose, Saddam refused to stop. He believed retreat was weakness, and weakness was death. Each military failure only deepened his obsession with winning. He built more statues of himself, gave fiery speeches about Iraqi heroism, and punished anyone who dared to question the war. The official story was simple. Iraq was winning, and Saddam was a savior. The truth, however, was that Iraq was drowning. By 1988, when the war finally ended with a United Nations ceasefire, Iraq's victory was an illusion. The economy was broken, cities were in ruins. Hundreds of thousands of young men were dead or disabled. Yet Saddam called it a great triumph. In his eyes, survival itself was victory. But the cost was devastating. Iraq owed billions of dollars to foreign nations, especially to its Arab neighbors, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, who had lent money to help Iraq during the war. Saddam expected gratitude, maybe even debt forgiveness. Instead, Kuwait refused to cancel the loans. To make matters worse, Kuwait began increasing its oil production, which caused global oil prices to drop. That meant Iraq's main source of income was shrinking fast. To Saddam, this was not just an economic problem, it was an insult. He felt betrayed by the very Arab brothers he believed he had protected. In his mind, Kuwait was not only ungrateful, it was stealing from Iraq. There were disputes over shared oil fields along the border, and Saddam accused Kuwait of slant drilling, secretly taking Iraqi oil. At first, he tried diplomacy, holding meetings and sending warnings. But as with every challenge in his life, diplomacy gave way to aggression. In the early morning hours of the 2nd of August 1990, Iraqi tanks crossed the Kuwaiti border. The invasion was swift, overwhelming, and brutal. In less than 48 hours, Kuwait fell. Its government fled, its army surrendered, and Saddam declared that Kuwait was now part of Iraq, its 19th province. On state television, he smiled proudly, presenting himself as a liberator who had corrected a historical injustice. But this time, the world did not stay silent. Within days, global outrage erupted. The United Nations condemned the invasion. The United States and its allies demanded Iraq's immediate withdrawal. When Saddam refused, they prepared for war. What Saddam failed to understand was that he was no longer fighting small neighbors. He was defying the world's greatest military powers. In January 1991, after months of warnings, the U.S.-led coalition launched Operation Desert Storm. For 5 weeks, airstrikes rained down on Iraq and Kuwait. Bombs destroyed military bases, communication lines, power plants, and bridges. Baghdad's night sky glowed with fire and thunder. Iraq's air defenses were crushed. Then came the ground invasion, swift, coordinated, and unstoppable. In just 100 hours, coalition forces liberated Kuwait and forced Saddam's troops to retreat. The war ended almost as quickly as it began. Iraq was defeated, its army humiliated, its image shattered. But once again, Saddam refused to admit loss. On Iraqi television, he appeared smiling, declaring a spiritual victory. The propaganda machine kept turning even as the country lay in ruins. The defeat had consequences far beyond the battlefield. After the war, Iraq faced crippling United Nations sanctions. It could not freely sell oil or import essential goods. Inflation exploded. Medicine ran out. Children starved. Electricity failed for hours every day. The economy collapsed, and ordinary Iraqis paid the price for their leader's pride. But the real explosion came from within. In the south, the long-oppressed Shia population began to rise up, hoping to finally overthrow Saddam. In the north, the Kurdish people also rebelled, dreaming of independence. For a brief moment, it looked like the regime might fall. But the U.S. coalition, which had stopped at the border, chose not to intervene inside Iraq. That gave Saddam time to strike back. He unleashed his army and air force on his own people. Tanks rolled through Shia towns. Entire Kurdish villages were bombed. Tens of thousands were killed. The lucky ones fled to refugee camps in neighboring countries. The rest vanished in mass graves. Once again, Iraq was silent. To ease humanitarian suffering, the United Nations later created the Oil for Food program, allowing Iraq to sell limited amounts of oil in exchange for food and medicine. But even that program became corrupt. Billions were siphoned off by Saddam's inner circle, while ordinary citizens continued to suffer. Throughout the 1,990 seconds, Iraq became a ghost of its former self, a land of decaying buildings, rationed food, and endless fear. Yet Saddam kept pretending that all was well. He built more palaces, printed more posters of himself, and gave more speeches about resistance and dignity. He was isolated, paranoid, and surrounded by yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear. To the world, Saddam remained defiant. To his people, he remained a dictator. To himself, he was still the same boy from Al-Auja, fighting to prove that no one could defeat him. But history had already made its judgment. His wars had cost Iraq millions of lives, destroyed its economy, and turned it from a rising power into a broken state. And still, Saddam was not finished. Another storm was coming, one that would not just shake his rule, but erase it completely. The 1,990 seconds left Iraq broken, bleeding, and isolated. Its people were starving under sanctions. Its economy was in ruins, and its leader Saddam Hussein was more paranoid than ever. Yet in his mind, he was still untouchable. He moved between secret palaces, surrounded himself with loyal guards, and continued to project the image of a fearless warrior defying the West. But behind those marble walls, the clock of history was ticking. Then the world changed overnight. On September 11th, 2001, the United States was attacked by a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda. 4 planes were hijacked, 2 crashed into the World Trade Center towers in New York, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 into a field in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The world was shocked. The U.S. government under President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror. And though Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11, his name quickly rose to the top of America's list of threats. The U.S. accused Saddam Hussein of hiding weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons capable of killing millions. They believed he might give such weapons to terrorists. Saddam denied everything, claiming Iraq had no such arsenal. United Nations inspectors searched the country repeatedly and found nothing conclusive. But the U.S. did not believe him. To them, his defiance looked like guilt. In early 2003, despite opposition from countries like France, Germany, and Russia, the United States and the United Kingdom decided to act. President Bush gave Saddam an ultimatum: leave Iraq within 48 hours or face war. Saddam appeared on Iraqi television in military uniform, refusing to bow. "Iraq will never surrender," he said. He believed that once again the world would hesitate. He was wrong. On March 20th, 2003, the skies over Baghdad lit up with fire. The U.S. and coalition forces launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. Explosions thundered across the capital. Missiles struck government buildings, military bases, and communication centers. The campaign was called Shock and Awe, and it was exactly that. Within days, U.S. ground troops rolled in from Kuwait, supported by air and naval power. Iraqi defenses crumbled almost instantly. Saddam tried to rally his forces through radio broadcasts, calling on Iraqis to resist, but the army was already collapsing. Officers fled, soldiers deserted, and the once feared Republican Guard melted away. In just 3 weeks, coalition troops reached Baghdad. On April 9th, 2003 inches, Firdos Square, a U.S. tank pulled down a massive statue of Saddam Hussein as crowds of Iraqis cheered, cried, and beat the fallen statue with shoes, a powerful symbol that the dictator's era was over. Yet, amid the chaos, one question echoed around the world. Where was Saddam? He had vanished. As his government disintegrated, Saddam slipped into hiding, moving between safe houses and underground bunkers. U.S. intelligence hunted him relentlessly, offering millions in reward for information. They arrested his sons Uday and Qusay after a violent gun battle, killing them both. They captured his aides, generals, and bodyguards. Still, Saddam remained a ghost. For 8 long months, Iraq spiraled into anarchy. Looters emptied government buildings. Militias began to form. Bombings erupted daily. Old religious and political tensions resurfaced. Sunnis and Shias, once bound by fear, now turned on each other. The same dictatorship that had kept Iraq silent had also kept it stable. With Saddam gone, chaos filled the vacuum. Then, on December 13th, 2003, U.S. forces launched a mission called Operation Red Dawn near Tikrit, Saddam's hometown. Acting on a tip, they searched 2 small farmhouses. Near one, they found a hidden hole in the ground, covered with bricks and dirt. When a soldier lifted the cover and shined a flashlight inside there, he was Saddam Hussein, dirty, tired, and defeated with a pistol he never used. "I am Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq. I want to negotiate," he said in English. But there was nothing left to negotiate. The man who once ruled with absolute power had been reduced to a fugitive in a hole. His capture was broadcast around the world. Iraqis celebrated in the streets. Some cried tears of joy, others watched in disbelief. The dictator who had controlled every word, every breath, every life in Iraq was now a prisoner. He was taken into U.S. custody and later handed to the Iraqi interim government for trial. The trial began in 2005. It was not just a legal event. It was history unfolding in real time. For months, Iraqis watched as Saddam sat in court, sometimes shouting, sometimes silent, often defiant. He denied all charges, mocked the judges, and refused to recognize the court's authority. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses told stories of torture, executions, and massacres ordered under his rule. Documents showed his direct involvement in the 1982 Dujail massacre, where over 140 villagers were executed after a failed assassination attempt against him. On November 5, 2006, the verdict came guilty of crimes against humanity. The sentence, death by hanging. Some Iraqis cheered, calling it justice. Others feared it would unleash more violence. But the decision stood. On December 30th, 2006, the morning of Eid al-Adha, while most Iraqis prepared for prayer and celebration, Saddam Hussein was led to the gallows. He wore a dark coat over a white shirt, his face calm, his voice steady. When offered a hood, he refused. The noose was placed around his neck. Moments later, it was done. The man who had ruled Iraq for 24 years through terror wars and lies was gone. His body was buried near his birthplace, Al-Auja. But even in death, his shadow lingered. Iraq did not find peace. In the years that followed, the country descended into sectarian violence and civil war. Extremist groups rose from the ashes of Saddam's regime, most famously ISIS, which would terrorize the world a decade later. The same fear that once held Iraq together now returned in new forms, darker and more chaotic. Today, Saddam Hussein remains one of history's most controversial figures. To some, he was a tyrant, a cruel dictator who destroyed his country and caused endless suffering. To others, he was a nationalist who stood up to Western powers and dreamed of Arab strength. But beyond all opinions, one truth remains: power built on fear cannot last. Saddam's story is not just Iraq's story. It is a mirror held up to the world. It shows what happens when trauma turns into tyranny, when strength replaces compassion, and when control becomes more important than truth. He began as a boy abandoned by love and ended as a man abandoned by everyone. His life is a warning written in history. Fear can silence a nation, but it cannot build peace. In the end, Saddam Hussein did not just lose his throne. He lost the illusion that fear could protect him. The silence he created swallowed him too. And though the world moved on the echoes of his rule, his cruelty, his ambition, and his downfall remain as a reminder that even the strongest towers of power eventually collapse when built on the broken ground of fear. If this story opened your eyes or touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who loves learning through real stories. Every share helps another person grow in English and understanding. And if you want more powerful stories like this, told slowly, clearly, and with meaning, subscribe to English Avenue today and turn your daily minutes into lifelong learning. Stay curious, stay strong, and keep listening.